So, political parties. In case it's not clear, here's where we're going to go. We want to understand the history of the idea of political parties. What we are not going to do in the depth that somebody may wish that I do is spend the bulk of our time in the 20th century digging in only to our current two major parties. We will meet them. One of them has the legacy really to the beginning of USA parties, so you'll see that. The other is slightly younger, and you may know which of those is which, but there's a much more fascinating history of USA political parties. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that many of our founders did not want them ever to exist. But as you can see from my title, we cannot escape them. That little red dot's too small. We can't escape them. And the reason why is because of what they are. Parties are, in general, factions. Their factions are gatherings of people who have like support believing around a certain viewpoint. Some of you know, not to toot my own horn or anything, but I ran for office in this city a few years ago. And this city has a political party. The members of that party hate to admit it because they know parties aren't good and they don't want to confuse people, but there's a party because there's a group of citizens in this city, for not evil purposes, who have a viewpoint around a certain faction. And as you can see there, this idea of gathered groups and occasionally getting named is old. It's an old concept going back. The Romans had it, the Persians had it, the Egyptians had it in some capacity. And you can see in the Middle Ages, some of the Italian city-states, you can see there it was connected, are you with the emperor or are you with the pope? But that's the idea that, think of political parties in a, I suppose I would say a loose gathering. Now we know, you know, that parties will have meetings in modern 21st century and they will write platforms and they will say, we think of these things. So it feels very determined, and then you can say, oh, I agree, I don't agree, I want to be a part, don't want to be a part. But if you can hold that a little loosely and step back from that and say, generally what you have in a party is a faction of people who have gathered around an idea or occasionally a person and say, I'm with this person, so I'm with the Pope. So then whatever the Pope wants, the Pope's ideas for the future of the civic society, that's what I'm going to agree with. Or I'm with the emperor. All right, so does that make sense for everybody? So our country begins, as you know, in its colonial history, at a time of great dynamism in England. In fact, this is one of the topics that I hope to do here at the library next year. The English 1600s is a dynamic time period, and it's a crucial time period for Americans if they wish to understand our founding. Because we think of our founding as starting in 1763, and that's false. Our founding begins in its colonial period. Now, I'm going to give a date, as some people are wont to do these days, and tie it to maybe one specific event. That's not what we need to get to. But what we want to see is that you can't divorce the people who were early Americans from their land. So when we go to Mars, and they put a colony on Mars, let's imagine the first rocket sent up there by Amazon because they want to build something, or maybe Walmart, they're going to do something, or maybe some church is going to send some rocket and go up there, and they all come from the United States. When they land, they will all be former citizens of the United States. It might be their intention to remain citizens of the United States, but they'll now be living on Mars. And initially, they'll just be people from the United States, or from Earth, they might say, living on Mars. But you can imagine, it won't take too many generations before the people born there will think of themselves not connected. But if in that third generation, they begin thinking of ways to separate themselves from Earth policies or specific national policies, if they understand themselves, they will still want to know, what was the Earth like when my grandparents left? Because that guides what they've done, either choices they've made to continue some idea or choices they've made to eliminate an idea. So in the 1600s, as England went through just a revolutionary period, 2 civil wars, one bloody, another one supposedly not bloody, the quote-unquote bloodless revolution, which in its official name is the Glorious Revolution, which is a name given to it by the winning historians. So there's your story of history is written by the victors, but it almost always is. And the job of a current historian is to kind of sift through that material. There became 2 terms, all connected to your view of governance. So the Whig Party, which you can see both of this, by the way, that both names are slurs. They're basically like put-downs. They're negative statements. So the Whig Party was the party of the Parliament. It's the party that was suggesting that Parliament needed to dominate governance. So in this time period in European history, France is going the other direction. So there is, we could say, kind of a experimentation amongst Europeans to say, well, what should governance look like? You have to remind yourself this is on the tail end of the Renaissance. So in England, they're really fleshing out the Renaissance, which reintroduces us from the time of the Romans and the Greeks to the concept that the human has a purpose. And indeed, actually, all the humans have some level of value. And from that concept in the Renaissance, eventually, and in England first, became the notion of, well, if every human has a mind and she can think and he has purpose and he can process, well, shouldn't they have something to do with the governance of the place they live? So this is revolutionary thought. And so in the outcome of the Glorious Revolution, the Parliament won. That's the short version. And when William and Mary came, they signed a Declaration of Rights which affirmed that they, William and Mary, would accept a limited or constrained position to the dominance of Parliament. Well, their opponents, before the Glorious Revolution happened and finished, were this group called the Tories, who affirmed the monarch and believed that no, the human and the history of the human, certainly the history of the last 1,000 years, had shown us that the individual may have some worth, but cannot adequately contribute to decision-making for the civic structure. And so this should be left in the hands of an individual and his privy council. Small group of elites make the decision. So this is what's going on while Maryland, Jamestown, eventually Virginia, and the New England states are being established. So the people who come after 1660, so all the rest of the colonies, are all coming in this mindset of the people should dominate, and the kind of the good guys are the Whigs, because they support the Parliament's victory over the monarch. Now, it's very important to notice, neither the Whigs or the Tories ever would have said anything like there should be no king. So you not only need an executive, but you need an executive who is affirmed by God. They still would have said that. And so you need a king. So nobody's getting rid of the king. A lot of people misunderstand Locke, who's writing at the time of the Glorious Revolution, and read into Locke an anti-monarchy position. And that's false. Well, Locke is a good monarchist, but the monarch needs to be bound or limited by the Parliament. So that's the view of those guys. And you see some of the things that they differed on, how they kind of viewed it, how they asserted it. So, as you roll into the Revolution then, this is in the ether. From the Glorious Revolution through the 1760s, in England, the Whigs are dominant. Now, there's no political parties in America, but the Whigs are dominant. But actually, King George III, when he takes over in 1760, he is determined to try to break Whig power, and to do that, he needs to affirm Tory power. And he's not doing that to somehow set up a pro-king government. One of the things that's misunderstood about George III, and you get it from the American propaganda, like Thomas Jefferson, that somehow he was a tyrant. And he was not a tyrant. In fact, part of why the American Revolution succeeded was because the king refused to act like a tyrant and take over control. Instead, he continued to honor the idea of monarchy in Parliament. So the idea of governance lying with Parliament, he has a role to play, but his role is limited. So when you go and study through all the major decisions like the Stamp Act or the coercive acts or the things that were done that for us were very inflammatory, the king was merely signing off on the decisions made by the Parliament. Right? So that as this happened, as the revolution's taking off in here, various members of the revolutionary class, so Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, began using the term Tory as an attack on anybody who was remaining loyal to the king. So you can begin already to see that within the humans in North America, there is the easy willingness to divide on an issue. And this, if no other thing you hear me say, this is the reason we have political parties. There's nothing more to it than that humans, in general, find it difficult to remain united beyond a certain number of people. If 5 of us go to Mars, well, probably before we get on the rocket, the 5 of us have locked in, we're buddies, and that will probably make it. But you bring 50 people, you know your own friend group. It's very difficult to have actually 50 friends that you know think everything like you think. So just give it time. Eventually, somebody will be unhappy. And you're like, the 50 of us, we all know each other, but this person's a jerk, and they're all of a sudden being stupid about how we use the resources. What are they doing? And eventually there'll be a division that occurs. One of the, lies is too strong, but one of the misunderstandings in American history, and it happens every time we run into this moment we're in now, which is the great crisis in which there's a philosophical divide between the country, is that the current members of the society believe this is an aberration. They believe that once upon a time we all agreed everything, and then this evil person or this evil idea showed up, and this caused division. If we could just squelch that person or eliminate that idea, we'd be all better off. And actually, the history of our country is one that we've always disagreed with each other. I always find that more soothing to myself to understand that, well, actually, we don't always agree. We rarely agree. In fact, they're the aberration moments, and they do exist. I'll show you one in a second. Is there are brief moments in time when it does look like the country, at least 80%, does all hold the same viewpoint. And again, one of the historical moments for us as a country, and I think is true for us as a species, is that moment does not last. It doesn't take long. So, when you get into the revolution, the loyalists and the patriots are the first split. With the revolution's victory, because we're moving quickly, trust me, I cut out about another 100 slides. I'm already behind, but I want to make sure you get this. There were 2 groups left. There was 1 group left. Everybody who supported the revolution. So this is my little silly little design here. But if you could take this line, and that red line is so small. If you take this line and go back up, it would go to another split like this one, where loyalists would be on one side and say patriots would be on this side. Where the loyalists left or were run out. There were few who stayed, and they learned to stay very quiet. But in general, the split. We write a constitution, a second constitution, called the Constitution. Convenient. And in that, the patriots split because the Constitution was a move away from John Locke. Now that's what we spent this whole year looking at. We're talking citizen civics, trying to understand the Constitution. And the very first one of the citizen civics, I gave the philosophical underpinnings that are the background of our Constitution. So if you want to email me, I'll send you the YouTube link and you can see that. And go back and check on that. The first government we had, the Articles of Confederation, was a pure Lockean document in which, for Locke, as I just described, the government should be limited, and if there's a central power, like a king, he should be weak. Right? Madison and Washington and Hamilton and the guys who wrote the Constitution, notice, not Jefferson, not Adams, believed we have to move at least some way away from Locke, because from their point of view, by 1786, the government or the society was struggling. There were some revolutionary moments, which Jefferson thought was fine. He thought we should have some blood spilt every 20 years, we'd be better off for it. In any case, when they write this new government, the split that occurs is those between who supports the Articles and who supports the Constitution. Now, by the way, if you're going to be, particularly younger people, decide you want to start a political party, you can learn a lesson right here. Never let your opponents label you. Because the Federalists quickly adopted, behind Hamilton mostly, but Madison to some degree, the viewpoint of we are creating a thing called a federation. It's actually, if you look at the definition of federalism at that moment, what they set up was actually opposite. But regardless, a blend between power at the state and the federal level. But again, more power with the central government. And then they quickly labeled their opponents anti-federalist. And as all of you can quickly tell, if you get into the anti-group, you never win the hearts and minds of the middle 70% who don't care, which is almost always the percentage. So, they go forward from there, and as we know, the Constitution passes, the Federalists win, the Anti-Federalists are not run out of the country, but they stay very quiet because they're on the losing side. So once again, we're united. Yay, let's go forward. Well, this uniting does not last because very quickly, decisions get made of domestic and international behavior, just like we're seeing passed in bills in our recent history, it happens all the time, that people disagree on. Is it a good thing that was just passed, or is it a bad thing? And you have different, in this room, there's about 40 of us or 30 of us, we would split at some level between whether we think it was good or bad, based on your perspective. And to their shock, the founding brothers, as Joe Ellis called them, split into two camps. And the persons who started it were Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Now, both of them would have never accepted the charge that I'm laying at their feet. You started a political party. Because in the country at this point, to be in a political party was considered a great evil. And you get that when you read Washington and Adams, both men who I contend were never a part of any party whatsoever. So Washington shows this in his farewell address, in which he's trying to describe to the country, if we don't stay united, we will not succeed. And one of his chief complaints was the factions that had emerged. Now, Washington, like John Adams, was in one sense blind to the cause. Meaning, for George Washington, he knew Jefferson had been behind the founding of the Republican Party. Not our Republican Party, we'll come to that in a second. But he never really was willing to admit that his protege, Alexander Hamilton, was the one founding the Federalist Party. And having mentioned Federalist Party, I have to stress for you, the challenge for students is that you have to be able to keep definitions in mind. So just real quickly, right? This is not the Federalist Party. This is a division of the Patriots. I wish that red was bigger. There's the Federalist of what I call the first definition. So if you were a Federalist of the first definition, you were a Federalist who supported the Constitution. So Thomas Jefferson is a Federalist. James Madison is a Federalist of the first definition. But fast forward about 5 years to where they're splitting over these, go to this part here. I'm sorry. They're splitting over how decisions be made, and so you have a Federalist of the second definition, a political party that is organized by Hamilton. And again, he, like Jefferson, would say, we're trying to preserve what we've started. This is why Jefferson uses the Republican label. He's trying to say we have to defend the Republic. As you know, of course, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Please tell me you know this. And so, as a republic, he's using this term. Now, by the way, if you Google it, you'll find 80% of people who post about Jefferson using a different name. And the reason you'll find that, one being most historians are of the Democrat Party, so that kind of biases them to how they want Jefferson to be remembered. But more importantly, they think it confuses people, which again, it probably does, because we do have a modern day Republican Party. So we think, oh, did Jefferson start the Republican Party? No, he did not. So we'll see, I'll get you there. So just for now, 1795, there's two parties, the Federalists and the Republicans. Here's Washington again, why it's bad. Again, he thinks it's bad because parties always distract public councils. They enfeeble the public administration. And this is the big one, they foment occasionally riot and insurrection. Now, if you think about our current day, not trying to attack either two of the two parties, you should go, oh wow, Washington was right. That's precisely what you see. So he's saying, this is not good. You know the really ironic part? His farewell address, he thought of retiring in 1792. And at that point, he was still friends with James Madison. So he asked James Madison to put some ideas on paper. When Washington, decided, no, I'm not going to retire. I'll suck it up for another term. He had those papers and just put them away. In 1796, he said, I am so out of here. He turned to his current protege, Alexander Hamilton, and said, hey, I got some ideas. that were written here take these ideas from Madison and form the declaration, or my final speech, which is not a speech, it's not a declaration, it was written. Washington would have read over it, would have maybe made some changes, but when you read the farewell address, you're reading the words of Hamilton and Madison. Now, Jefferson founds the Republican Party, but Madison is the face of the Republican Party. Madison is the energy of the Republican Party. So the hilarious part is you have these ideas of Washington coming from the two men who founded the two parties. Do you see the irony there? So it also proves the point that I was saying to you. If you'd ask either man, did you form a party? No, absolutely not. No. I did try to defend the Republic from those evil people who were trying to ruin things. And Jefferson's pointing at Hamilton, and Hamilton's pointing at Jefferson. And if you think about our current political parties, you're like, that's the same thing that happens today. It's identical to what happens today. Adams joined him in his opposition. And these are too long of quotes to read to try to say you were remotely on time. But as you read them, both of these are written in the early 1800s, where Adams is expressing his frustration. And Adams' frustration comes primarily because he becomes the poster child for demonstrating if you are not part of a political party, you will not win an election, period. Which I'll show you this in a little bit more detail in just a second. So Adams and Washington, in my contention, are not part of either political party for the reasons you can see. And again, the word faction is the one they throw around, that there's a faction involved. And factions are seen as unhelpful at best and most likely evil in the process. So in the process, then you can see kind of working through this slide. But here's the things that split the founders. And again, the specifics of these, you can go into detail later, but what I really want you to think about is just replace everything on that bullet list with like domestic policy, the first bullet list, coronavirus, the second bullet list, environmental crisis, the third bullet list, inflation. And so, in other words, they were dividing on the obvious things of division that a governance has to make a decision about something either domestically or internationally. Now, where then this led them to their two views is here. So this middle section, again, boy, this slide is terrible. This middle column is showing you the topic, and you can see how the two parties believed. For instance, the focus of the economy for the Federalist was industry. Hamilton, I suppose to his credit, was the far-seeing founder who said the country will become industrial. Jefferson longed for the country to remain in a small farmer agrarian structure forever. And so you can see that difference is there. Their foreign policy, how they understood the Constitution. We've gone into some depth in other meetings, but loose construction means I can do anything as the government unless the Constitution prohibits it directly. Right? So, can I have a national policy on health care? Well, the Constitution doesn't say I can't, so I can't. Strict construction is where the Republicans were, and so in strict construction, you can only do the things that the Constitution specifically states you can do. So does the Constitution say anything about a national health care plan? Nope, so you can't do that. If you can keep in your minds loose and strict construction, although currently both parties that we have are loose construction advocates, but occasionally you'll hear them differing on something specific that one or the other is trying to do. If you keep in your mind loose and strict construction, you get it every time. It's like putting on a fresh glass. You're like, oh, I see what's happening here. And typically, from the strict construction point of view, you're trying to prohibit your other party from doing stuff. That's the bottom line. But again, loose construction is what everybody goes to. So Jefferson, who was a champion of strict construction until he becomes the president, and the moment he becomes the president, he was a loose constructionist. The purchasing of Louisiana was illegal in the sense of specifically, A, does the Constitution allow for it, and then B, you hear that ringing? Hope it's not me. And B, Congress had agreed to a certain amount of money that was really to buy New Orleans. But when Monroe was over there and Napoleon's like, you want to buy everything? Monroe's no dummy. He's like, yes. If you can imagine somebody from the Federalist Party saying, do you have permission to do that? Monroe would be like, nope. and I'm going to do it anyway, because I know my boy, Jefferson, will back me because he loves land, right? So he would have been in for it. So again, and he's the one Jefferson, who sends us into our our second undeclared war with the Barbary pirates. But again, something done the Constitution says not to do. So basically every president, in fact, I would say there's not been a single president who has ever governed from a strict construction point of view. All right. Now, this takes us to the election of 1796, but it's the election after Washington steps down. And this is the last election in which there are no parties involved. But the factions are already there, and they're starting to kind of blend themselves in. When Jefferson came in second by the Constitution at that time, he was automatically the vice president. And Adams went to him and said, hey, let's do this together, kind of a co-presidency. We're friends. Jefferson said, no way, I'm not going to do it. Really, he was advised by Madison, don't do that. So this is the beginning of the end for Adams, where he learns the truth that if you're not part of a party, you will not win. And so he rules for his 4 years. It's not smooth. We have very few presidents have smooth 4-year terms, and his was not smooth. A lot of challenges that went on in his time period. And when the election of 1800 came along, he, of course, was up. Now, keep in mind, at this point, nobody chose to run for office because the Electoral College actually worked the way it was supposed to work, which is the group of voters for a state who are that state's chosen voters could vote for whoever they wanted. And if you look for the election results of the first, say, to the 1820s, you'll always find a variety of people getting electoral votes, whereas most of us know, if you look at most election maps, there's a few outliers. It's the two main parties who have all the electoral votes. That's because of warping that we did to the Electoral College. That's neither here nor there. So it didn't matter whether you wanted to be the president. Somebody might say, I think you, Eric, could be a great person for president. They vote for you, whether you want to or not. And the implication was, if you got elected, you would serve because you are a good citizen. Adams gets opposed, obviously, by Jefferson and the Republicans, but he gets opposed by Hamilton and the Federalists as well. And this map, well, I kind of already told you this, so I'm going to skip past this to this map here. This is misleading. This is a modern take on it, where you can see Jefferson and Burr looped together. That's inaccurate. Burr was independent and Pinckney was independent. And they ended this way, 73, 73, 65, 64. We had not had a tie yet. The tie went to the House of Representatives. There was a long voting process. But the point for you and me to see is that Adams, having no political party, could not generate votes. And in fact, if you know the Hamilton story, you know that there's a moment when he kind of writes this really long, like 30-page screed where he just kind of goes unhinged about how much he hates John Adams. And then it gets into print. The Republicans get a hold of it. They happily put it into the paper. It actually was a good weapon against Hamilton, but it led to, at the last minute, Adams getting a few more votes so that he did pass Pinckney because he got the sympathy vote from people. Now, this victory by Jefferson sets up what is often called the era of good feelings. But another way to think of it is, for the next 24 years, there will be only one political party. So if you've ever wondered what it'd be like to live at a time where there weren't political parties, there was only one, here it is. This is the moment. Everybody who could run for office ran within this one party. And again, they would not have been flashing their credentials around like, I'm a Republican, like happens today often when you run. But nonetheless, that's the pressure. The Federalists exist to some degree in New England, and as you can see, they were trying to do some early secession. Secession does not start in 1860. It starts back under President Washington, the first group that proposed secession in the western part of Pennsylvania, some whiskey farmers. So, in this time period then, the election of 1824 leads us to our next issue, our next group of parties. You've had no parties, we have one party, Jefferson's party. Now I want you to look, something curious has happened that I want to see if you can pick this up as we go down this list here. So look here on the right. Right? So when Washington is president, Thomas Jefferson becomes Secretary of State. We're going to skip Adams. When Jefferson is president, picks James Madison. Madison is president, picks James Monroe. And when Monroe's president, picks John Quincy Adams. If you'd been a young person born in 1800 and now 24 years of age, what would you have assumed had somehow been concluded about our country? Like, how is the president chosen?
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, automatically. So if you're John Quincy Adams, or you are somebody from New England, you assume he'll be the next president. There weren't really any elections. I mean, there were some elections, but there was no campaigning, no elections, because there was no parties. And it's like, obviously this is the case. Except, there's a couple of problems here. One, John Quincy Adams is not from Virginia, which if you notice all these other names, they're from Virginia. If you know anybody from Virginia, they know this should be the United States of Virginia. The rest of us don't matter. If you talk to any Virginian about it. Well, John Quincy Adams thought he'd be elected, maybe chosen, but he wasn't popular. Another young man, in his 30s, Henry Clay, who had been successful in helping us navigate the Missouri Compromise, thought I should be it. And they're maybe the leading candidates as we think about leading candidates when we're thinking about elections. But again, neither one were from Virginia. And for John Quincy, of course, his dad was John, so then it's a black mark against him. Nobody likes John Adams. So into the party says, well, we're going to do our own person. So for the first time, the party really comes out clearly and says, we've chosen a candidate. It was a guy from Georgia, funny enough, not from Virginia, but he was a good Republican, good Jeffersonian. But once it became clear that in the country for the 24 election, there was going to be a debate, right? Because you had John Quincy, who was clearly the most qualified person for the job. You had Henry Clay, who was perhaps the most dynamic person for the job from a legislative point of view. Then you have the party itself saying, well, here's the candidate. Tennessee's like, oh, we're going to get in on this story. And so the Tennesseans jump in and they go, we got somebody for you. And so they put forward the most popular person. So now, if you ever complain about our modern elections, say, oh, it's just become a popularity contest. I hate that, which it has, and I do. It actually starts here in 1824. Because the Tennesseans knew their candidate was popular, and that would lead the way. So the 24 election actually had 4 real candidates running. This is not correct here where it says no parties. It should say Republican, 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 Republican. As you can see, it's very tight. Everybody wins some electoral votes right here, but nobody won a majority. And so this meant, much like the 1800 election, it would go to the House of Representatives. Well, you guys, of course, all know that House of Representatives is run by the Speaker of the House. So guess who the Speaker of the House was? Henry Clay. So the dude who came in fourth, who could not be in the running, because when there's a tie, it's top, or if there's no majority, top 3 vote getters, right? If you remember the 2016 election, you knew your Libertarian Party and Gary Johnson, there was some talk amongst the Libertarians that maybe they could make that happen. If he was 3rd vote getter, even if he was very, very low vote getter, he'd be in the decision by the House of Representatives, right? And so Henry Clay, now the problem is the politicians don't like John Quincy Adams because he's actually too smart. And he was very stiff. He never had a childhood, quite honestly. That's part of the problem. Brilliant man. But so he never really had a childhood. They didn't like him, but they're afraid of Andrew Jackson. And to remind yourself, this isn't the time of Napoleon. Now, Napoleon's dead at this point. You know how on the internet, if you really get going in a blustery kind of fight on the internet, the moment somebody drops the H word, it's over. The moment somebody calls somebody Hitler, why? Well, because Hitler is the boogeyman in our story, current day. Maybe in the future, who knows what will happen in Ukraine and Russia? Maybe Putin will become that person. Well, I don't know. But for now, for the past 70 years, you want to throw a hand grenade into a conversation. I wouldn't advise this, but if you decide you really want to blow up your workplace, start calling your boss Hitler. The moment you do, it's all over at that point, right? Napoleon was that guy in the minds of most people because of who he was, how he did things, and things that he had accomplished and or done. Tyrannical kind of way, dictatorial kind of way. So for the many political leaders, they looked at a guy like Andrew Jackson as a potential Napoleon. So they don't like him. So they choose John Quincy Adams. And so John Quincy Adams is chosen. But look what John Quincy Adams does. He chooses Henry Clay as a Secretary of State. Now, if you're a fan of Andrew Jackson, can you see it? You're mad. Because now it looks like clearly the Speaker of the House had been in cahoots with you to give you the place. And Jackson and his supporters quickly labeled this the corrupt bargain. Now, there's actually no evidence whatsoever that Clay was in any conversations with anybody, and more than likely he was in conversations with fans of both men. And who knows, he might have been listening and saying, well, who's going to be the best offer? But in any case, Henry Clay, who will run for president 3 times and lose all times, clearly wanted to be the president. So who knows, maybe he did think he was being bought for the story and was excited about it. This will then lead to our next big division. Because out of this election, Jackson, who did not want to be the president. He was not a fan, wasn't interested. But by after losing the way he lost, and from his point of view, smaller here, but look, I got the most votes. Jackson is the guy running for president at the moment when the country is starting to talk in terms of democracy. The words being bantered about. Tocqueville's written his book. There's a lot of combination of, certainly small d, democratic, was often used. But now you're getting kind of large D, democracy should be where we go. So Jackson's running around going, hey, I got the most votes. And we all know in a democracy, that's what's supposed to happen. Which, by the way, is your clue to remind your friends, we don't live in a democracy. We could. We need to make a new government to do so, a new constitution. But we could. We're alive at the first time in human history, a country our size could be a democracy. But we weren't. But for Jackson, it became a very good message. And so, along with Martin Van Buren, who becomes kind of his major advocate, they begin working for the 28 campaign, and they do so by splitting the Republican Party. Martin Van Buren is the one who said, look, we need to have a plan. How can the party get its person forward and eliminate other rivals from within the party? And in New York State, they already had this kind of machinery in place, where the different factions in New York State would decide who was going to run for office before anybody's name was really coming forward. And then once concluded, that was it. If you're in the party, you're supporting this way it is. We know that feeling. We see that through our primary system. And then eventually, no matter who's winning, usually if you're an advocate for one of the two current day political parties, you fall in line. You may be muttering, but you fall in line. Most of you. Most Americans do. And it's Martin Van Buren who really creates the apparatus that we understand of a political party, political structure. So in 27, he lays his case out in a letter to the Southerners, because he wants the Southerners who are Republican. Remember, everybody's Republican. There's no other party at this point. But he wants them to understand. And he says this. He says, look, we need to reorganize the Republican Party. We need to reorganize it in a way that will allow us to avoid having quote-unquote favorite sons chosen. And instead, we'll have a substitute party principle for personal preference. You know, we don't need the Kentuckians throwing Henry Clay in or the New Englanders throwing John Quincy in. The party leaders will make decisions. And so then he says, notice what he talks about. General Jackson's personal popularity will be sufficient for us to gather. And out of that comes the Democrat-Republican Party. Now, this is the term, if you go and Google it and look for Jefferson, you'll often see. It's erroneous to do so. The reason it's erroneous is because it robs Jackson and Van Buren of their moment. So there's a Republican Party that was against the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party died, 24 years of Republican-only rule, and the Republicans split over this fight over who should have won 24's election. And the introduction of this concept of democracy, which again, you know, we are not. So you go down that road. And so Van Buren is the one who's going to set up this split. Now, Clay and Adams will foolishly follow their lead and call themselves the National Republicans. What they should have done is said, no, dadgummit, we're the Republicans, and tried to claim the old name, but they don't. And they're trying to say, again, with all these names, certainly in the 19th century, if you look at the name, you can begin to understand what is the party fighting for. So Jackson and Van Buren are saying, we're fighting for the common person through democracy. And Clay and Adams are saying, we're fighting for the benefit of the nation. Well, of course, democracy is far more sexy, and it wins. And so the 28 election, very ugly in the process. A lot of things go down. John C. Calhoun, who's a critical player in politics, will switch sides, give his support to Jackson, which will itself be controversial in the process. This is the first election in which you start having more states having open voting. For every citizen can vote. And that begins to be the moment when we see the move that I call the warping of the Electoral College, but the move to what our modern Electoral College looks like, where the Electoral College voters are theoretically at least tied down to what the citizens of the state said. By the way, that is not in the Constitution. So if one day you are an ever electoral voter and you said, I will vote for this party if we win, and then you win, and then you want to vote for somebody else, you have every legal right to do it. Whether you'd have the courage to do it or not, you of course would never be in that party ever again because they would get rid of you for having disobeyed the rule. So this election, it's a slam dunk, of course, for Jackson, and they win. Democracy. See, it's a victory for democracy, the idea of democracy in the process. So here's our group. Now, by 32, 33, it becomes easier just to use the word Democrat. Think of how they used to print things in the paper. Just too many words to write Democratic, Republican. So they shorten it to Democrat. And this is the birth of the Democratic Party. But the Democrat Party, this is our party. So this is our Democrat Party today. Can and appropriately does trace its lineage back to Jefferson, which is probably another reason why Democrat historians don't want to actually call Jefferson's party the Republicans, because they don't want to have a problem there. In print, if you go to the Democratic website, they'll claim the 1848 convention. It's in the papers before that. And sometimes when it's in the papers as an epitaph. Because again, our founders are universally clear, except for Jefferson, some, and Franklin for sure. Every founder thought democracy was a bad idea. It would just lead us to chaos and trouble. You don't have to agree with them, but that's their viewpoint. So when you see in the papers like, oh, the Democrat, you'll see that from the 1800s to 24. They're not calling that person Democrat in connection to the political party, which is born here. They're calling it that way, almost like a slur about the person in print. All right. So from here we've got our structure. But it doesn't take long before Jackson, in the way he led the country, to lead to opposition. Now Jackson, until our 2016 president, was our most contentious, most inflammatory, most controversial president. Yes, I am including Nixon in that conversation. It's a blast to study Jackson. I love Jackson, and I'm a Tennessean, but he's just fun because he's so exciting, and whether I like all this stuff. And he had at least 3 major crisis points. In those crisis points, universally for his 8 years, Jackson will rule with the power being centralized in the presidency. This is one of the major divisions he has with Henry Clay. Like, where should the power of the government lie? And for Jackson, the power of the government lay with the president. Whereas for Clay and our founders, the power of the government lay with the parliament, the House of Representatives, Congress. Right? You see them linking themselves back to the Whigs in that concept. Right? So Jackson ruling, we would say dictatorially, authoritatively, which again, you may go, oh, that sounds familiar, led his opponents to say, well, he's like a king. King Andrew. This is not a positive poster here. So, of course, in their own history, known history, there's a party for that. So they congealed around that party of the Whigs. So now we have the American Whigs. And their usage of the term is to be a slam against Jackson. So again, read the name, know the point. The point is the president is acting like a king. And that's bad. So we're going to try to convince, and at this time, everybody would have known what they meant. Nobody would have been confused, what's going on, in the process with why you're using that term Whig. And, if you look at their differences, you can see it. Jackson wanted a limited government, but really I should have probably written limited government with him at the center of it. Another place to put difference is what I just said to you. The Democrats were more for the president representing the people. The Whigs were more for Congress representing the people. And you can see some hints backwards to the Federalists, but not much. These are both from the Republican lineage. They're both Jeffersonian in their lineage backwards. Is the key difference or key issue being Jackson. Martin Van Buren's decision to kind of create party apparatus is really the birth of the party system as we understand it in our time period. Does that make sense for everybody? I'm sure I haven't lost anybody. Okay. Now, the 36th election, they try to go back to the House of Representatives. It doesn't work, so the next year, they throw everybody behind William Henry Harrison in 1840, and the Whigs will win. Now, this is the moment you start seeing third parties emerge. Now, just all cards on the table, I am a huge advocate and proponent for third parties. And I will tell you, again, cards on the table, you don't have to agree with me. The only reason we don't have active and large third parties is because people choose to not vote for them. That's the only reason. There's nothing in our state because, well, the parliamentary system, they have third parties. No, they don't. They have two major parties and a lot of small parties. Study Germany, go to France, look at all, but there are multiple parties, right? And why is that? Well, because the people have grown up choosing to vote for them. And yes, they don't have a president to vote for that's that way, right? But regardless, we could have third parties. You just don't ever vote for them for one reason or another, which is you're right, of course. So there's several that come at this point. In fact, the Whig Party technically is a third party. They're an outsider group. They're not an established group. They're not kind of lineage from the Federalists. They're a third party. So when people say third parties can't win, 1840, they won the presidency. Upon winning, they become the named party. So then they are like in the two-party system, they are the second party. But you need to see them as a victorious third party making their way in. We're about to see another one in just a minute. But here's some of the other ones that emerge at this point. So at this time period, it's 1825 to 1840, 1850, you have the emergence of abolition parties. But you have the anti-Masonic parties. There's people who are afraid of the Masons as a group. And if you've ever done any study in conspiracy theory in the United States, you may have heard about the Masons and that whole story. There was a political party that came around them. They're actually the first party to have a national convention in choosing a candidate. The Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, again, totally giving away what's their issue, were parties for abolition. The American Party, you may not know, but you may know its cute nickname, the Know Nothing Party. It's the party for the Fight Club fans. Everybody knows the first rule of Fight Club, right? Don't talk about Fight Club, right? And the Know Nothing Party, exactly at that point. Aren't you in a political party? No, I don't. Oh, you're in the. I know nothing. I don't know what I'm talking about. Which is weird to us because you're like, well, how would you win any fans with that? I don't know. How did Fight Club get bigger and bigger? I guess because of the secrecy. They were going into the 1850s, most observers of politics believed if someone was going to be a successful third party or at least supplant one of the two bigger parties, it would have been the Know Nothing Party. Because their issue of immigration was a hot button issue. So again, do not think that our current day fights over immigration are somehow new or unique to us in the 21st century. They are not. And again, they would have all known we're recent immigrants. We don't want those people. And there is probably a racist overtone to it. I'd like to just make this point. Their racism was white on white because we're not a bunch of white people. I'm a German. I am a German. Don't throw me in with those Irish people, and don't throw me in with the Welsh, and don't throw me in with the British. Sometimes we confuse ourselves by trying to lump things into bigger groups than actually would be true. So they didn't like the Irish coming, and they also were afraid of Catholics. Sorry if you were of the Catholic faith. They're opposed to that. Now, so the Liberty Party pops in. You see the abolition parties there. Now, the idea of the abolition movement paired itself with the other major social movement, Manifest Destiny. So Manifest Destiny, which you of course know is our push across the West. These two things will spiral to lead us to the Civil War. There's a whole nother 2-hour conversation about that in the process. But one of the things you can see out of this is the animation between people or for people who are both Manifest Destiny advocates and abolition advocates. They're not usually the same, but two groups. So they're going to fight for what they believe in, and they want to fight in politics, whatever the cost may be. And so, for instance, in the 1844 election, the Liberty Party, in its second campaign, won significant votes in these 3 states. And most historians will tell you that's the reason Henry Clay and the Whigs lost the 44 election. And it's because Clay was not as openly anti-slavery as would have been beneficial to him in the North. Southern Whigs would have abandoned him had he done so. So again, the challenge of a national candidate trying to find their spot. When we took the land from Mexico, the Mexican-American War, a new abolition party showed up, which Free Soil, which again tells you what they want. In the new land, the land should be free, should not have slavery included. This becomes very controversial for Americans, and it will lead then to our coming of the death of the Whig Party. The Whig Party was not capable of dealing with these challenges of Manifest Destiny and abolition. They didn't pivot fast enough to be on one side or the other. And reason why, as I just told you, they were a national party, North and South. But what's happening in the South at this point from the mid-1840s is the South is increasingly becoming what Madison was afraid of, a unified geographical faction. Madison argued in Federalist number 10 that one way we will pull off a large republic is that there will always be divisions, rich, poor, urban, rural, Christian, non-Christian, Catholic, Protestant, all these kinds of things, and that multiple levels of division will be to our benefit. It'll pull us in multiple directions, much like a spider's web pulls in different directions to provide stability to the web itself. But he said in Federalist number 10, if there's ever a moment when one geographic region coalesces, well, that can be problematic. So that's happening at this moment. So the Whigs then are challenged because for the Southerners, they're feeling put upon and attacked. So it's hard for the Whigs to come out and really clarify which position they're taking. Now the Democrats have the same problem, but they're the more established and stronger rooted party. So they're confronting this challenge. We're going to see the Democrats pull off what I believe is a singular political miracle in all of human history. I know no other group that does what the Democrats did, which we'll get to in a second. So, as you head into the middle 1850s, on the verge of the Civil War, a series of events are happening which are leading things to being quite explosive. And from one way of looking at it, the Civil War does not actually begin with the firing on Fort Sumter, but it begins in Kansas, because open warfare breaks out in Kansas over slavery. Now there's more there I don't have time to tell you, but I would tell you after the meeting if you want to know it. So a third abolition group begins to coalesce around the Kansas issue. And they thought to themselves, we need a cool name. We've had the Liberty Party, which is a different group of people. We've had the Free Soil Party, that makes sense, but it's kind of clunky. We need a name that's cool. We need a name that's sexy. We need a name that will resonate. And they realized, wait a minute, there's a USA historical name of a political agency that's not being used. And thus, the Republican Party was born. Because they said, nobody's using Jefferson's name. We'll use it, and it will by default link us to Jefferson. It doesn't matter to us that he was a slaveholder and we're an abolition party. It's just that it'll be beneficial to us because nobody's using it. So they create the Republican Party. And you go into the 56 election, which you can see here on this map. It was a mess, quite honestly. Going into it, 5 parties ran, and they ran fairly aggressively. And so nobody assumed they would win because the 4 of them would probably disperse any opposition to the Democrats. But the question was, what would happen to the Whigs? And to the shock of everyone, the Republicans came in second. As I told you a minute ago, most everybody assumed that the Know Nothing Party would replace the Whigs. Yes?
So the Republican Party was absorbed, or the Whigs were absorbed into the Republican Party.
A better way to say, she said, were the Whigs absorbed the Republican Party? Well, the way I would say it is, think of it as the Whig Party died. And now you're a good Whig, and you're like, what am I going to do? And you look around, and northern Whigs, like Abraham Lincoln, will reluctantly go, okay, I guess I'll go over here to the Republican Party. Why reluctantly? Because the Republican Party was an abolition party. And Whigs like Lincoln were not abolitionists. Lincoln was never an abolitionist his entire life. He personally did not like slavery. He was not an abolitionist. So to join that party meant A, I have to change, or B, they need to broaden their base, which they will. By the 1870s, the Republicans will broaden their base. They will be seeking to bring Whigs in.
But the ideas of the Whig Party were going into the Republican Party.
The ideas of the Whig Party, no, they weren't actually. Again, the Republicans, like the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party, had one agenda point: ending slavery. And in fact, Lincoln being chosen, the Republicans. And Lincoln being chosen in 1860 was very controversial amongst the original Republicans, which now has only been 5 years back, because he was not an abolitionist. But because of his election campaign in 58 and some of his writings, he had become popular. And he was everybody's second choice. So in the 1860 nominating camp, there were like 4 leading Republicans who were all good Republicans, meaning they were all abolitionists. But they were regionally divided. And it's like, I'll vote for him or I'll vote for Lincoln, but I'm sure as hell not voting for him. even though they're both good abolitionists. And Lincoln became everybody's second choice.
Because he wasn't really a good abolitionist.
That's correct. You have to, again, it's not anything to besmirch the president, but Lincoln was never an abolitionist. The Emancipation Proclamation is not a document of abolition. It's a political, diplomatic miracle or masterpiece by Lincoln, but it has nothing to do with abolition. And most people don't understand that.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's very confusing. We spent a good hour and a half on that in my class because of what the Emancipation Proclamation actually does. It's a misnomer. I'm going to get in trouble now. It's a misnomer to call Lincoln the great emancipator because he emancipated no one. And he's a good man who I like a lot. Stay after class, I'll tell you. All right, so the Whigs die. The Whigs die. And now, if you're a Whig, you got to figure out what you're going to do, and most will join the Republican Party. So this gives us the Democrats, again, this terrible red light. That's an arrow there. They go to today. It's the last you'll see of this slide. And the Republicans, they go to today. So from this point now, we have our two major parties set out in kind of their position. Okay? Now, after the war, because we're skipping forward, trying to get to the 20th century, I promise. The Republicans are able to appropriately position themselves as the savior of the country. And amongst African Americans, they are positioned as the party that led to our freedom. The Republican Party will, in Congress, pass the 13th Amendment, which did provide freedom for all the slaves. And Lincoln, to his great credit, was a champion behind the scenes, pushing, cajoling, arm-twisting Republicans and a few Democrats to sign on to the 13th Amendment. So he did not oppose it. He hated slavery. Now here's where the miracle happens. In my research, which, obviously is one human, so I could have missed a lot of stuff, I have never found a situation where a nation had a civil war in which a political group or party had defended or supported the Civil War to, in essence, split the country, and then lost, and then remained. That you have a Democratic Party today that is a continuous legacy back to Jackson and Jefferson is a political miracle. It should not have happened. Now realize, when I talk about the Republicans or Democrats in history, I'm not talking about you, and as you may pick up, may go, wait, that's not what the party believes today. There's changes that will occur. We'll hopefully get there, okay? But the Democrats were the traitors. They were the party of treason. They supported and openly advocated for the destruction of the country. They lost. Most of us would say yay. And then somehow they survived. I have found no other country, no other political experiment through antiquity to modern day where that has been the case. That's amazing to me. Partially they're able to do it because they dominated in the South. Northern Democrats stayed quiet, kind of like the old Federalists had stayed quiet to some degree, kind of keep your head down. They still would have some Democrat candidates winning mayoral candidacies or representative candidacies in Ohio and Michigan and Illinois. There still was an active two-party system in the North. But the dominance of the Democratic Party after the war for the next 30 years, really to Woodrow Wilson, was regional in the South. And to some degree, because of what I would call missed opportunities, if not out-and-out failures during Reconstruction, the Republican Party did not, the moment did not occur in which the natural death of the Democratic Party should have taken place. That they should have died out. Not because I don't like Democrats. I have actually voted Democratic before. I kind of vote all over the place. But the Democratic Party, just in the sense of, at that moment in time, they should have died out. But during Reconstruction, choices were made, I think, damning and detrimental. Some of the issues we're dealing with today, socially, domestically, in my opinion, are linked back to the failure of Reconstruction. But the Democrats will remain. They will win one presidency from the Civil War until Woodrow Wilson in 1912, and that's Grover Cleveland, who was a reformer, which is part of why he was able to win the time he won. What did the Democrats focus on? Again, if you're a Democrat, don't get offended, don't get frustrated. But they were very clear in what they wanted. They wanted to maintain the social order in the South that they had lived with and grown up with. I think to some degree I understand that. Many people today are fighting for the things you're fighting for politically because you want to maintain what you believe a good social, or go back to the beginning of our discussion, what is a political party? It's a faction around an idea, and most often the people supporting their party believe it's the best thing for the country. I think if we would just be a little more generous to one another, we could say, okay, we disagree, but I respect that that's what you see. It's not you're evil or you're hateful. It's like, oh, okay. So they go out of their way, particularly in the South, to do everything they can to deny the African American vote. Now, by extension, that's denying the Republican vote. But I don't think it's fair to say the Democrats were trying to squelch the Republican vote, because it's not that open. They were trying to squelch the black vote. That's what they were trying to do. And they did it quite successfully. If you look at this voting, now this is total participation, but this purple line in all the southern states is very high because African Americans were allowed to vote, thanks to the 14th and 15th Amendment. And clearly, by 1912, they're hardly voting at all. And in some cases, like in Mississippi, by 1892, they're not voting at all. And that's because of a variety of rules that were set in place. This is why, in your lifetime, in my lifetime, you've remembered candidacies from, say, the 1980s on, and still to this day happens occasionally, where we'll hear, NBC or CBS doing the reporting after the election, and they'll say, oh, for the first time since ever, a Republican won such and such in some city in the South, or some position in the South. Well, why? Well, because the bulk of the voters in the South who were Republican or African American were denied to vote, and maybe a little known fact that you may not understand, the Klan was eagerly after any white person who did not protect their race. So if you had the audacity to vote for the Republicans, you were a black lover and you were evil, and they'd come burn a cross in your front yard. And it was effective. Social ostracism and physical terror works. It's why there's terrorism. It's using terror to accomplish a political means, and it's very effective because most of us are kind of casual, average people who don't like to get in trouble or get hurt or be in anybody's way. And so this works very effectively. So now we get our next party. From Reconstruction to the 1900s, 20th century, a whole host of changes occurred to the country. In fact, I've done a long series on the 19th century, which I can send you the YouTube link to that if you want to see it, when I volunteer at Westminster Senior Living Center. We did a very long series on this time period. But a whole host of things. The West was further developed, the coming of the Industrial Revolution in America, the rise of urbanism, all these things began to change. You have two parties, Republicans, Democrats. But in the West, a movement begins to emerge with the people who feel aggrieved and who feel left out of the system back east. In one sense, it's very much like the American Revolution, which at its heart has a sense of a people thinking the government in London is too far away from us to understand what we are going through. So in the West, in Kansas and in Colorado and in Idaho, citizens believed DC was too far from them to understand their issues. At least the two political parties did not seem interested in what was going on for them. So this group of a variety of different people began to coalesce into a thing called the Populist Party. The Populist Party will gather, and they'll actually meet in Ocala, right up the road from here, to write their first political platform. Their platform, and the same platform will be spoken in 1892, was quite expressive in ways that you should go, oh, that all sounds familiar. But in the 19th century, it was very radical. They wanted things like an income tax. They wanted things like direct elections. They wanted things like private elections. They wanted the government to control things like banks. They wanted an 8-hour workday. They wanted women to get to vote. Now, if you had any study in the 20th century history, you might say to yourself, wait a minute, that sounds like the progressive movement. And now you know who started the progressive movement. The Populist Party, coming out of the West, were the first to articulate what we come, for good or ill, so every April 15th, like, damn you, Populist Party. The idea is that we begin to enshrine through a variety of constitutional amendments and decisions made by both political parties to support kind of where the country's going to go. Now, the Populist Party emerged and were the most likely candidate for replacing the Democrat Party. Remember I told you, political miracle. The Democrat Party was, because of its regional location, was ripe for takeover. As you have this other party in the entire west of the country, except for maybe California, which is pretty solidly Republican, imagine that. But the 1896 election is the undoing of the populists because they could not foresee, which nobody could have, kind of a rise of a champion who will begin the process of moving the Democrat Party from what we just described to the Democrat Party you know today, which I think, to be fairly stated, is more a champion of civil liberties, more a champion of an activist government, more a champion of the government should do more things, which again, the founders would not have agreed with, and the Republicans certainly did not agree with in the process. This is the 1892 election. Their populist candidate was this man Weaver. And you can see they won 22 electoral votes. So they did pretty well for a third party. In 1893, a Great Depression hit. And it's like all Great Depressions, like we may be about to go through now, where a lot of people lose jobs and things become very expensive and businesses close and banks close. And as a part, go back for a second, as a part of their view, there it is. See this third bullet point? Silver is usable currency alongside gold. It's a quite esoteric thing, which would need an economist here to really explain well. And I'm not. And I'll say openly that economists are usually teaching voodoo anyway. Which is why you have political candidates and you have 14 economists on each side with PhDs and they never agree about anything. Whereas if you had 14 scientists and they were all biologists, they'd say, yep, H2O, that's the... Anyway, I digress. What economists tell us is that in a political system, or a governing system, an economic system particularly, if you have two types of currency, it is not good. It's a thing called Gresham's Law. You can Google it and look it up. But the populace, being out west into this map, they're strongest out here, right? In the west, as you know, actually, you all know, of course, we brought gold out of the ground, San Francisco 49ers. We actually brought more silver than gold out of the ground. And because of the Industrial Revolution, and silver being a key componentry in electrical conduit, silver became very popular. But it wasn't always popular because it was subject to the markets. So silver advocates wanted to be able to have both, the ability to sell it to great industrial powers, but also, if need be, use it as currency, as clear silver. But because we followed the world power, diplomatically, militarily, and economically, Great Britain, they were on the gold standard. So we were on the gold standard. The populists were arguing silver was the solution. Now, whether silver would have worked, we don't know. But going into the 96 election, the populists were giddy. Oh man, this is it. This is our moment. I mean, look at this map. We did well just in the West. And if you had gotten closer on the election, do I have it here? You'll see that there's lots of support, all the green here, in places where they didn't win the electoral, so they're excited. And the fact that there was a Great Depression in which they could beat the drum of we need silver as a currency to solve our problems would be magic for them. Well, so going into the 96 election, then, they chose the strategy, or tactic maybe, of waiting while the Republicans and the Democrats had their national conventions. Because they just knew, because both parties were, and to some degree, in cahoots with big business, they will, of course, announce the gold standard. Why would they not announce the gold standard? The Republicans follow suit. They absolutely do, and they bring McKinley as their candidate, gold standard. And the Democrats were largely on that road, but you know how conventions go. People give up and give speeches. Now, if you were here, all of you were alive, but if you were watching the Democratic Convention in 2004, and you were paying attention, whether you're neutral or one side or the other, you knew that the candidate they put forward in 2004 had no chance in hell of winning that election. And no offense to him, but not charismatic at all. But if you watched the convention that week, you were there when a charismatic, brilliant, seductive, good-looking, and erudite young man stepped to the podium, and the world got its first look at Barack Obama. And if you were a Democrat, you were like, can we nominate him now? And of course you couldn't because of the way the rules work at this point for candidates. And of course we know what happened in 2008. Well, back then those rules did not exist. And so into our story comes his equivalent. This man here, William Jennings Bryan, the youngest man to run for office at this point, stepped up, made a speech, and in his speech he had the audacity to say, we ought to have silver. He called it that we should not be crucified, the country should not be crucified on a cross of gold. And it was revolutionary for the Democrats. He was so well spoken, and they immediately made him the candidate. And the populace were like, what? Because now their thunder had been stolen, and they didn't know what to do. And then they made the worst mistake of saying, well, we will also choose Bryan as our candidate, hoping that he somehow would choose them, which of course he would never have done that. You're not going to go from one of the top two parties to announce, we really am running with this third party. So the populace will die in the 96 election. McKinley wins. There's pretty good evidence that he was pretty much bought and sold by the industrialists of the day. And so in the process, the Democrats are able to undercut the populace. But with Bryan as their candidate, he'll be their leading candidate. He'll be their face until 1912. And he will continue to kind of champion the ideas of the populace, that list of things. The Democrat Party begins to make its slow shift and transition to the party you largely know today. Now, at the same time, when the Populist Party died, the progressive movement began. The progressive movement's not a party. It's the movement of the various ideas and others that the populists had championed. Again, the ones the populists championed and others began to emanate out. And the progressive movement never became a congealed party. It was just this movement. And it became so powerful that, here's the election, but we'll skip to this. It became so powerful that both parties began to have a civil war. This, by the way, just trying not to make too many comments about today. This is where we are today, in my opinion. That both parties are in the midst of their own civil war. And that makes it difficult for the adherents like you and me to know exactly who we want to be aligned with, because it's not clear which of the divisions within the Democrats, Republicans will actually win. Again, I'll leave that there for now. But at this point, progressivism was a little stronger in the Republican Party. Could be shocking for some of you, based on what you think of the parties today, but it was active in both. So in essence, as I show my students, there's this moment from the 1896 election to really 1920, where the two parties are in a tug of war. We're progressive. No, we're progressive. No, we're. And at the same time, the Republicans and Democrats who were arguing we're progressive are having to fend off what was called the old guard in their own party who did not want to be progressive. Does that make sense for each other, everybody? The progressives, now you and I can say, oh, what they should have done is kind of loop this together, right? And there was an attempt a couple of times, but they could never fully get on board with each other because of the differences on some other aspects. Progressives never are able to congeal into a political entity because there were too many points. If you study the progressive movement, what you should see, or what I believe you see, is a myriad of things in which a person can hold up and say, I'm a progressive, so I think women should vote. And I could be over here saying, I'm a progressive, and I think there should be educational reform, and no woman should ever vote. And I could happily and be proudly proclaimed as a progressive. I'm a progressive in alliance with the NAACP that African Americans should have all equal rights. I could be over here saying, alcohol is the evil of all things. We must ban alcohol, and no African American should ever get to vote. Does that make sense? So the myriad of things kind of kept it from ever congealing around one good party. And it also helped that both parties wanted to be progressive. Now, this will be the times of the progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, and in the 1912 election, Woodrow Wilson. But it's also the coming of our another third party. In this time period, in the 1880s, we're really in Europe in 1840s, 1820s even, you had the emergence of socialism. By the way, for everybody to know here, in my class, and since I'm the one teaching, you're in my class, political parties or political concepts are not good or bad. They're amoral. They're just ideas in which one can choose to see it what it does. So communism is not evil, democracy is not evil, not good, right? I know everybody won't agree with me on that, which is fine. But I think it's helpful if we can look as social scientists and try to say, I don't have an opinion of whether fascism is good or bad, just a political concept. But then as a historian, I can say, well, every time that's been tried, it doesn't look good. And I would not want to live in a country that's governed that way. But we don't just try to observe it without letting ourselves become too emotional, either in love or in opposition to it. So Socialist Party, they're not evil, not a bad thing. And they really begin to harp on the ideas of the progressive movement, because there's a bunch of progressivism things that kind of emanate out from their viewpoint. This is good for us. This is the way we should go. So they wanted, for instance, more government control. They wanted to control all these things here. It's hard to see. You can't see it. Metals and irons. All lands, right, that aren't currently held. They wanted these political changes. They're, again, in support of the income tax. Universal suffrage for everybody. Everybody gets to vote. If you're alive and breathing, you're voting. We don't need a Senate. We should just have a Congress that's a single house. We shouldn't have the Supreme Court being allowed to have judicial review, which, if you know your Supreme Court history, is not in the Constitution. And they wanted it kind of directly attacked and opposed, right? A lot of workers' rights issues. So again, to some degree, what you may have been able to tell me had I said, tell me what you think the Socialist Party believes in. There's a lot of good collaborative kinds of ideas, and they're lockstep with progressivism in general terms, okay? So into the 1912 election then, this becomes to me the most dynamic election, maybe in close competition with the 24 election. You have four brilliant men running. All four would have been good presidents. Three of them were presidents. All were progressive. And they're all trying to vie for each other. The 1912 election, to me, is actually the most important election we've ever had because of what it says about the country, which I'll explain in just a minute. Roosevelt had been the president. As you know, McKinley gets assassinated. He gets the presidency early 1901, stays the president, wins in 04, stays through 08, and then in the 04 election had bravely said, I will not run again, trying to follow the path of Washington, where presidents only ran for 2 terms. But having left to go on a world tour for a while, by 1910, Teddy Roosevelt was the most recognizable person in the entire world. When he came back, his hand-picked successor was not governing the way he wanted it to be governed. It's because he and Taft were different people, of course. So he decides he's going to get involved, even though he knew this will probably become a calamity for the Republicans, because it would open the door for the Democrats, remember, who had not won anything except for the 2 off terms of Cleveland. So they were the second party, but they were the minority party. They had never had really the voice that they had used to have prior to Civil War. Let's open the door for them, and it does. So there's a fight in the Republican nomination. This is very useful here too. This is the beginning of what you and I know as the primary system. So in the primary system, as you know, each state votes, and theoretically then going into the convention, the voters from that state then will say, we are putting our electoral or our nominating votes behind candidate X, that's who we're supporting. And that only happened in a few states at this point. But in every state that it happened, Roosevelt won. And again, one reason why it's important to note this is because you're seeing in the early 20th century the continuation of the growth of the pro-capital D, we are a democracy concept. Right, so by the early 20th century, this is a big drumbeat that the populists and the progressives are hitting. Democracy's good. The founders were wrong. Democracy's good. We need more democracy. One of the things the populists and progressives after them would say generally is, part of our problem is the corrupt government. How do we fix the corruption? More democracy. Democracy is like a cleansing agent. Right, we only got a few more minutes, I promise. We're going to get to a place where we can stop, and then I'll let you decide if you want me to go forward in the rest of the 20th century. The 1912 election, then, is putting this to the test. In the convention, the party bosses still ran enough things that they could affirm Taft as their choice. So TR will leave the convention, literally walks across the street. He made it sound spontaneous, but he'd already actually paid for the hotel across the street to be ready for him because he knew it was going to go this way. And he announced his candidacy, running independently. A lot of names got labeled to it, but when he was asked if he was physically well enough to run, TR made the very famous statement that he felt as fit as a bull moose. And thus the Bull Moose Party became TR's party. You can see it as very progressive. He's far more progressive in the 1912 election than he was as president in 01 to 08 process. So here's your four candidates. Taft, who was the moderate progressive. His opponents would accuse him of being conservative or non-progressive, as you can see his quote there. And I'm entitled to the term progressive. And he had indeed done, if you study his 4 years in office, a lot of the progressive ideology. But he had worked more closely with the old guard, and TR had fought more often with the old guard of the Republicans. Of course, Debs is running for the socialist viewpoint. TR will be the Bull Moose Party. He called his thing New Nationalism. And you can see in it more government action. The Democrats saw their moment and said, we must have a progressive candidate. So they scoured far and wide, and they found the current governor of New Jersey, Woodrow Wilson, who they had basically plucked out of obscurity as the then president of Princeton, to run for office. When he was chosen to run for the governorship, kind of the leading Democrat political advocacy group said, he doesn't even know who the party members are in his own state. He's like me, an academic, not really necessarily paying attention, and Woodrow Wilson, far more advanced than myself, elite-wise, was very involved in reform for education. But he will become a very tireless advocate for many progressive changes in the state of New Jersey. And there's some sense in which the Democrats could already see that running him against Taft would be a victory for the Democrats. TR adding in just made it easier. And so you have these four men running for office, all four men quite brilliant, and all four men are progressive. So at this juncture, from 1912 to this very day, the United States is a progressive country. With the sole exception, perhaps, of Ronald Reagan in 1980, every president has been an open advocate for the progressive movement. Different levels, certainly. If you put them side by side, you'd say this was more progressive than this one. When I say progressive, don't think in modern terms of how you may want to use that word to define social views, but think in terms of how the progressive movement meant it. A more activist government, a government that controls more things, pro or more democracy, more involved in the lives of the citizens, and they all were progressive, doing a variety of progressive things in the process. Now, I think since we're close to the end, this is the best place for me to pause, and I am going to pop out and pop right back in, because I'm going to not make you sit there and go through all of these. I'm going to go all the way to the end, and I'm going to put this right here up. And then I will keep going, anybody who wishes me to, but I don't want to overstay my welcome. From this point forward, the Democrat Party will move consistently to become the more progressive party. The loss for the Republicans and the subsequent war, World War I, we should have never got involved with. We did largely because of how much progressivism had infiltrated our international relations. That's a whole long story, but there's a sense in which you look at our international interactions starting in, say, 1900 or even 1890 forward. It's based on progressive views, which I don't mean that in an evil or ugly kind of way. Because of that because Wilson was progressive, TR, had he won, he would have been in 1914. So I'm not trying to say Wilson did a bad thing, and TR, had he won, or Taft, had he won, would have done something else. That's not the point. All four of the men, I think, except for Debs, because the socialists worldwide were opposed to the war because of their view that it only aided industrialists. When Wilson gets in 1917, the war goes poorly in the sense that people died in the war. Kind of should have seen that coming, but people still walked away from the tragedy. There's a lot of enthusiasm for war for some reason. And then when it's halfway through, everybody realizes how bloody it is and why do we do this? And then the Treaty of Versailles becomes a disaster. And Wilson had hung his hat on this as kind of his crowning achievement. So that by the 1920s, remember that tug of war? The Republicans, we're the progressives. No, we're the 1920, they let go of the rope. The Republicans, yeah, y'all are progressives. They're the progressives. Those guys, the Democrats, they're the progressives. Those loser progressives, that's who got us into that war. There's a stupid treaty. Look what those progressives did to us. And the three presidents who won in the 20s were all Republicans who, like Reagan, were not very progressive. They still were a little progressive, but not very progressive, not comparatively. And so at that point, the division is made. Republicans would maintain themselves as the party of big business, would maintain themselves, at least initially, as the party of small government, taking the Democrats' position where they previously had. All the Democrats have become the party of activism, doing more things. And once you get to the Great Depression and the election of FDR, the fate is sealed. If there was any debate from the 20s that perhaps the country might back away on some areas from its progressivism, by the victory of FDR and his 4 terms, obviously, and the tying of FDR and FDR's actions to the victory in the war, FDR's ideas were seen as sacrosanct. And his ideas were merely a continuation of his second cousin, who was a Republican, largely. Does that make sense? Other third parties will come. You know these parties. I was going to show you some different things, but again, we're at the end of our time. I want to stop and pause and let you leave if you want to leave or ask me any questions. But the history of the political parties goes back to this idea of following behind a certain viewpoint. And to date, we've had no change since 1912. The Republicans had a moment. I'll just say this briefly. The Republicans had a moment. Reagan was the first person to run and win saying progressivism was bad, loosely, right? And to some degree, he governed that way, although he was not as conservative as modern conservatives like to think about Reagan. But nonetheless, he governed in a sort of, but in 1988, the Republicans did not nominate another Reagan conservative. They nominated a moderate. And when Mr. Bush won the presidency, in my opinion, you don't have to agree with me, but Mr. Bush, Mr. Clinton, and Mr. Bush are the same guy. We had the same president for like 24 years. A few social differences here and there, but they governed in the nearly exact same way. But it was progressive. Not, again, progressivism, not bad. Just saying it's progressive, not where Reagan was. So the Republicans having their moment to perhaps make a change, a la what FDR did or what happened with the 3 progressive presidents, they gave away by not choosing a conservative as their candidate in 1988. Where we go next, who knows? Again, in my opinion, we're in the middle of a civil war amongst the parties, and they've not congealed yet as to who or what they think. So I'm going to stop there, see if there's any questions anybody wants to ask about what's been covered, and that may be just the best place to stop in general. But
I heard somewhere that Woodrow Wilson, when he was at the Treaty of Versailles, may have been sick with the Spanish flu, and it affected his something.
was Woodrow Wilson sick during the Treaty of Versailles, possibly with the Spanish flu? He definitely was sick. I don't think he had the Spanish flu necessarily. I've not seen that, but he was sick. I don't think that has impacted him, but what really happened to him is he has a stroke once he gets back, and he's unable to help get it through the senatorial elections at that time period. You guys are awesome. I so love being here. I think we're going to stop here unless if somebody who desperately wants to see the rest of the 20th century. You know most of it. Most of us have lived through a large portion of it. Thank you so much. Please thank the library. If you've not signed the little card thing like that, it helps the librarians if you do. Thank you so much. Hopefully see you next month.
What's next one? Yeah, what's next one?
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I promised you. There it is.